I'm Liam Heenahan from the Environmental Science Program at DePaul. Welcome to Cities and the Environment ENV 200. I apologize that I can't be there in person as you may have seen from the email I sent to you yesterday. My father was quite ill, so I came over to Dublin just to help him in the early stages of his recovery. I thought rather than spending the time now describing the syllabus that what I would do is just give you some notes and some small assignments that you can be thinking about until we meet on Monday. And these notes with a couple of short assignments, I'm going to primarily kind of read them from notes here, and I'll follow up by giving you access to those notes if you want to read along with them after watching this video. So thanks a lot for watching this, and I will see you on Monday, where we'll describe the describe the syllabus and talk a little bit about the work we're going to be doing over the next 10 weeks. So as I said, I'm writing these comments in Dublin, which as a city of about 1,000 years old is actually a relative latecomer as far as cities go. As early as the 10th century, so in the 900 ADs, the Vikings who founded Dublin set about fortifying the early city, which was pretty small, with earthen banks. So raising a wall essentially that served to protect the city from invasion. These banks were comprised of clay, of mud that they took from the river Liffey. Of course, it wasn't called the Liffey at the time, and of course all of the organic refuse that they were producing. So high mounds all across the early city. Despite such defenses, Dublin suffered a devastating attack in about 944 AD, and the young city was sacked, completely destroyed. So recognizing that the earthen banks were not going to be a proper defense, the subsequent walls of Dublin were much more substantially constructed and were made out of limestone. This type of limestone, locally called calp limestone, CALP, was quarried in Dublin County and brought to the city in vast blocks of limestone. This indicated, of course, that Dublin at that time, even in its early days, was growing in both wealth and in political power. Just the sheer ability to get that limestone quarried and into the new city and erected as a defensive wall. So these walls, when they were finished, were about 7 meters, so over 20 feet high, and between about 1.5 meters and 3 meters wide, so up to 10 feet wide almost in some places. One would have expected that these would have provided a much more significant level of defense than the walls that had come before them. However, just as it was the case with the earthen banks, these walls in their turn had only mixed success. Sometimes indeed they repelled invaders, but at other times they were overrun, and it resulted in much loss of life for dwellers within the city. So over the subsequent centuries in Dublin history, the walls were occasionally, they fell into disrepair, and then depending upon the need or the wealth at the time, they were sometimes reconstructed. There was, for instance, a massive refortification project undertaken in the 13th century. Eventually, walls of Dublin fell into disuse and were overrun by the growing city itself. Thus, the boundaries of Dublin essentially left the ancient city walls behind, and this in fact is a common fate for many of the fortifications of the older cities of the world, that you'll find the walls of the city kind of well within today's city limits. These days, few Dubliners even know where to find evidence of the old wall, although there is, of course, some of the fragments still scattered around the city. In fact, I, along with my colleague Hugh Bartling from Public Policy, bring a group of students to Ireland every summer, starting in Dublin, going around the country, and we get to see some of these early fragments of the old city wall. By the time Dublin started its experiments with the walls in the 10th century, as I said, when Dublin was established in the 900s, the idea of cities was pretty old at that point, and the idea of physical defences, walls for cities, was itself millennia old. So many of the cities of the ancient world were indeed walled. So a minimum definition of a city, this is something that I think we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about next week, which is, how exactly do we define a city? We're talking about cities in the environment, but what's our minimal definition of what a city is in the first place? But the minimal definition in terms of being able to archaeologically recognize a city, particularly one of great antiquity, many of which are no longer occupied, were lost cities. The minimum definition is that it's a landscape that's been constructed by humans and is different from the land surrounding it, the so-called hinterlands. Though city walls per se are not part of the definition of cities, nonetheless, walls are artifacts that can be pretty reasonably extrapolated from this simple definition of the city, of any urban settlement. And that's because the city wall kind of confirms that the area of constructed value has some value relative to the areas around it. So typically cities accumulate valuables, either cultural valuables, tangible valuables, wealth, and these are both worth raiding from the outside and protecting from the inside. So the example of a city that I particularly want you to think about in the coming days is Uruk in Mesopotamia, in what is today modern southern Iraq, is the paradigm of the early city. Very well studied, a lot of archaeological work that has gone on there, so we understand the workings of this city pretty well. That city has its origin in about the 5th millennium BC, and it developed, so it would have been one of the very early cities, but it initially developed from two settlements that were on either side of a small tributary of the Euphrates. That tributary has now dried up. The city grew over the following 1,000 years or so, and by about 3200 BC, it occupied about 250 hectares, which is about the area that was covered in Grant Park, essentially, for the World's Columbian Exposition, which was in 1893. So not a huge area, but not insubstantial at the same time. Within a few centuries, the area of Uruk had more than doubled in size. Now, one of the reasons why Uruk is a fairly distinguished, famous city is not just because it's one of the oldest. The actual oldest is a matter of contestation, something we can talk about next week. But one of the reasons that Uruk is considered to be especially interesting is that it's the setting for one of the world's oldest pieces of great literature. And by the way, this confluence of writing and literature and the city is not a coincidental coalescing. It's something that we need to talk about in the coming weeks. But the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the name of the earliest great piece of literature, is named after a king of the same name, King Gilgamesh, who was a hero, a legendary figure from the 3rd millennium BC. The story is about 3,000 lines long, essentially written in verse, though most modern translations are not, in fact, written that way. And it was written down on 12 tablets in about the year 2000 BC. So, over 4,000 years old, this book. It still reads really well, and if you were feeling ambitious, you can get a pretty cheap copy of it online, and I would strongly recommend taking a look at this story. So remember, the story is distinctive because it's set in one of these earliest cities on Earth. The written form of the verse itself is built upon an older oral tradition. So just like the Odyssey or the Iliad of Homer, people would have been telling stories about Gilgamesh for quite a deal longer than than the period in which it was written down. And even when people were telling this story, they were still commemorating events that went back nearly 1,000 years before that, to about 28,000 BC. So as early as the 2nd verse in this Epic of Gilgamesh, the walls of the old city were mentioned. So I'm just going to read you a line or two from it. Afar he, Gilgamesh, journeyed and returned home, weary and worn. Maybe like a lot of us, after a break, back to Chicago, Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, weary and worn. Whereupon did he grave or engrave upon a tablet of stone the account of his travels and his travails. The mighty ramparts of the high-walled city of Uruk did he build. So, significantly, it was Gilgamesh that built the walls around the city. And also the walls of the hallowed temple Enna, that sacred sanctuary. So there was a walled section within the walled city, and in that walled section was the temple of the gods. And thereafter, any time that the epic makes reference to Uruk, they mention that it's high-walled, because this is one of the principal characteristics of that early city. The city walls are interesting, and they have a pretty ancient history. So city walls have been a feature generally of cities since their inception, right back to the beginning, although, of course, walls and fortifications are a less prevalent feature of cities today. So you don't, for instance, have a wall all the way around Chicago, even if you can distinguish the political boundary between the limits of the city and on into the more rural counties. The reasons for the existence of city walls, and we've already had a taste of this from looking at the history of Dublin city walls, it's not difficult to comprehend. But nonetheless, I think it's useful to articulate these reasons. So I'm going to leave that task for you, and maybe for Monday when we meet, I just want you to jot down bullet points. You don't have to write it up and hand it into me, but I want you to jot down what you see as being functionally important about city walls. And then if you can, using the same line of thinking, suggest why city walls are no longer prevalent. So why were walls so necessary to the early city, and why have they generally fallen into disuse. I don't think that this is a particularly difficult thing to explain, but I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say about it. Though the function of city walls may not be, in fact, difficult to understand or comprehend, nonetheless, it's worth thinking for a little bit about the nature of walls in general. And I guess in doing this, I'm trying to develop what you could call a sort of philosophy of walls. What is a wall in a more general sense? So any philosophical account of wall that we could develop is going to have a lot in common with an account of boundaries or borders, partitions, frontiers, and the like. So what is a wall? Very generally speaking, this is drawing upon a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. A wall is an enclosing structure composed of bricks, stones, or similar material laid out in a regular fashion. That's a wall. Though it does not have to be the case, most walls function by separating two areas that have prior distinctions from one another. So if you saw a wall in the middle of a homogeneous field, you might wonder what exactly that wall was doing, because more typically you have two areas that are distinct from one another that are separated by this boundary, and that boundary is kind of signified by this enclosing structure. So walls serve to reinforce existing boundaries. So there's a general definition of walls because it can be applied to cell walls that separate the cell contents from the environment in which the cell is found, garden walls that separate areas that are set aside for ornamental plants or edible vegetables and the like from wilder areas or perhaps from houses. Again, making a kind of a separation between distinct areas. You're concretizing them by a wall. But even Pink Floyd's Wall in the album called The Wall serves to isolate one region, in that case Pink's ego, his traumatized ego, from the hostile world that surrounds him. So in cities which we've defined minimally as landscapes constructed by humans and differentiated from the lands around them, a wall is typically, though it doesn't always have to be, an enclosure that runs along a boundary in this designated landscape. Thus the kernel, the essence of the notion of wall in general is that it divides in ways that are easily legible to us, that can be read very easily by human observers, distinguishing an inside from an outside. So walls are definitions made concrete, often very literally. So walls are definitions made concrete. So without wanting to get too carried away with these thoughts about a general philosophy of walls and the like, I think it's interesting for us to note at the same time that to define anything can be seen as placing a wall around that thing. So the etymology, the origins of the word define, kind of lends a certain strength to this argument. To define derives from Middle English and Old French define, which means to end, terminate, determine. And in Latin, there is the verb definire, which means to bound, to put a boundary on something. So definitions like walls provide boundaries. Okay, this is what I'm getting at here. It's not obvious already. That we can kind of playfully ask how you define the city. That is, conceptually, how do you put a wall around our notion of the city? Where does the city end and things that are not the city begin? Moreover, you could ask, what is a city distinguished from a village or a hamlet or a town, and more remotely from the countryside or anything that you choose to define? We might see already that this minimal definition of a city, which we have talked about before where we define it simply as a constructed landscape distinguished from the hinterland, it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't give very many details about what a city actually is. So can we go further? This is leading to a second little assignment. If the city limit, bounded by a wall or not, marks the end of one entity, which is the city, and the beginning of another, which is the hinterland, the countryside, what exactly are the distinguishing characteristics of the former, the city? How do you distinguish the city from things that are not the city? And to add just a little more zest to the question, we should demand that our list of city characteristics, urban characteristics, capture features that are held in common by all entities in chronological order. So it should, every time we use the city, whether it's a ancient walled city, modern Dublin, Greek and Roman cities, medieval cities, Chicago, whatever it is, if they're all to be called a city, what are the elements that they have in common? What are the attributes of human populations that live there? What are the distinctive social institutions associated with these urban locations? What sort of institutions would you typically associate with urban locations? You know, you'll have a lot of insight into this if you actually take a little look at that Epic of Gilgamesh. So, for instance, religious institutions, that temple, for instance, is that sort of institution, the kind of creation of temples, is that something that is associated with cities uniquely? Perhaps not, but that's something that I'd like you to think about. What are the cultural characteristics of urbanites, people who live in cities? You know, whether you live in Dublin or Chicago or New York, is there a set of cultural characteristics of people living in cities that are different from people who live in the countryside? And if so, what are they? And finally, what are the environmental properties of cities? What is the distinctive environment and maybe also the sort of environmental problems associated with living in cities? So, your assignment, and second assignment here, is to make a bulleted list. Again, just jot it down, bulleted list of those characteristics of cities under the heading population, institutions, and cultural characteristics. Population, institutions, cultural characteristics, and finally, of course, environmental characteristics of cities. So, thanks a lot for trying to follow along. It's my first adventure into sending videos out to a class. We'll see how it works. I'm excited to meet you on Monday, and thanks for taking a look at this movie. Thank you.